You may not sleep tonight, because once you've seen them, the white-robed figures moving like ghosts across muddy fields, their backs torn open, their whips slick with their own blood, you begin to wonder, what kind of pain must a man choose to believe it leads to salvation? It is the year 1348, and Europe is unraveling. The air smells of rot and damp wood. Every breeze seems to carry with it something sinister, something too small to see, but big enough to kill entire cities. In a village somewhere between the Black Forest and the banks of the Rhine, a crowd gathers in silence. Mothers clutch their children. Old men lower their hats. The baker's fire has gone out. No one is working today, they're all waiting. Then the silence breaks, a slow, droning chant, low voices humming the same note over and over, like a dirge. And from the far edge of the village road, they appear. Dozens of men, barefoot and pale, wearing long white robes stained with dust, sweat, and something darker. Their faces are hidden beneath hoods. Hoods that only allow the eyes to look forward, or perhaps inward. Each of them carries a whip, some with leather thongs, others with braided cords embedded with shards of bone, glass, or metal. They walk in rhythm, 2 by 2, and after every 7 step, they stop. They kneel, and they whip. The sound is soft, almost sickening. Not the loud crack of punishment, but the wet slap of raw flesh meeting steel. Sometimes there's a grunt, a gasp, a tremor of the body as skin parts and blood begins to flow. Then they rise, step, 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 and kneel again. No one intervenes, not even when one of them stumbles or when blood pools beneath their knees. Because this is their sacrifice, and to them, it is holy. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, where pain becomes prayer and silence speaks louder than miracles, then let Midnight Histories walk with you through the shadows. Subscribe if you haven't already. These are the whispers the world tried to forget. They called themselves Penitents. They believed that the world was drowning in sin and that no priest, no pope, no cathedral could cleanse it. Only blood. Only theirs. It didn't start with plague. The first flagellants appeared a century earlier when drought and famine left Europe's crops withering in the fields. Some said God was punishing the people. Others said the church had grown too rich, too powerful, too distant. So groups of men began walking from town to town, whipping themselves in public squares, begging forgiveness, not for their own sins alone, but for all of humanity's. They became walking psalms, singing, bleeding, marching in rhythm with something deeper than doctrine. And in a world where the line between faith and fear was paper thin, they were seen not as madmen, but as saints in motion. But it was not until the Black Death arrived that the flagellants truly multiplied. The plague moved fast. From Sicily to Paris, from London to Prague, the dead piled higher than the living. And the people were desperate, not just for a cure, but for meaning. The church in many places failed to respond. Some priests fled, others died. Still others sold indulgences to the dying, trading eternal peace for coin. And in that silence, the flagellants grew louder. They believed the plague was no accident. It was punishment. God had turned his face away, and only an ocean of blood could make him look back. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of men joined long pilgrimages. They walked barefoot across stone and thorn, sang Latin hymns until their voices broke and struck their backs again and again and again, until their robes clung to them like second skins of blood. Sometimes they'd enter a village and the people would fall to their knees, believing the penitents brought divine forgiveness. Sometimes they would chase out priests, destroy churches they believed had grown too corrupt. They began holding their own rituals, preaching their own interpretations. And in that moment, the penitents crossed a line. They were no longer just pilgrims. They were becoming something else, a movement, a challenge to power. But let's step back. To the mind of just one man, imagine him, 33 years old, once a cobbler. His wife and 2 sons died in a single week from the plague. He buried them himself in a pit outside the city wall. No priest came, no one sang. The ground was too frozen to dig deep. So he stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and one day he followed the singing voices. The first time the whip touched his back, he didn't feel pain, only heat. And when he saw the blood, his blood, it was as if he'd made an offering, as if he'd finally done something, anything. He would go on like this for months. His skin turned to scar tissue. His feet cracked and bled. He no longer remembered his own name, only the chant, only the rhythm. Some nights the flagellants would collapse in barns, too weak to sing, shivering in their own filth, but still murmuring prayers in the dark. Not all of them believed. Some were there to escape justice. Others sought spectacle. But for many, most, it was real. Their pain was the only thing they could still control. In a world gone mad with death, at least their suffering had purpose. By the winter of 1349, the movement had grown into a force the church could no longer ignore. Whispers spread that the flagellants had begun claiming divine authority, that they held secret meetings, that they no longer prayed to Rome. Pope Clement VI declared them heretics. Bishops were ordered to arrest their leaders. In some towns, penitents were imprisoned. In others, they simply vanished, dispersed into forests, mountains, deserts. But the marks they left behind, blood stains on monastery steps, singed grass where they knelt and bled, remained for years. And in the minds of the people, those images never fully faded. So what drives a man to beat himself bloody in front of strangers? Is it guilt or grief? Or is it hope, twisted and raw, that maybe suffering is a kind of language God still listens to? The sky is gray, not storm gray, not dusk gray. But that peculiar shade of sickness, like the world itself, is holding its breath, waiting for something to die. A bell rings in the village, not from the church tower. That bell has not sounded in weeks. It is a handbell, cracked and rusted, shaken by a small boy who doesn't understand its purpose, only that he was told, "Ring it when they come." And they are coming, the flagellants. Their procession stretches from one end of the valley to the other. Hundreds of white figures, hooded and bleeding, each one part of a great moving wound. In the distance, the chant begins. Not words exactly, just tone, sounds stripped of language. It rolls across the hills like fog. The villagers watch from behind shutters, from behind the barrels and carts hastily stacked into barricades. Some have left bread on the steps. Others have left nothing, only silence. Then the penitents reach the square. They form a circle, and in the center, one of them steps forward. He removes his robe, slowly, reverently. The fabric sticks to his skin, damp with sweat and blood. His back is a ruin, striped with lash marks, some still open, some closed into scars so thick they look like ropes. He turns to face the others and kneels. Then the ritual begins. Each man takes a turn, whipping himself across the back, across the chest, even across the face. There is no crying out, only breath, and the sound of blood striking stone. They say this spectacle drives away sin. They say it cleanses the soul, not just for themselves, but for all those who watch. In the spring of 1349, these rituals reach their peak. In France, Germany, the Low Countries, Villages and cities alike were visited by the penitents. They moved in 40-day cycles, echoing the length of Christ's fast in the desert. Each night they slept in barns, in churches, or under open sky. They were not allowed to speak to women. They were not allowed to bathe. They lived on bread, ale, and ashes, and each day they bled. But their purpose was not just penance, it was intervention. They believed that their suffering could shield others, that by opening their own flesh, they could absorb the wrath of God and turn his gaze away from the rest of humanity. People welcomed them at first. When the Black Death came, it came with no warning, no cure, no explanation. The doctors were useless. The priests gave up. But the flagellants, they offered something different. Not answers, but action. Visible, painful, relentless action. And in a world where God had gone silent, a man who bled for you felt like a small miracle. But miracles, like blood, attract flies. By summer, the church began to worry. Whispers rose through the cloisters and papal chambers that the penitents were preaching without permission, that they had begun to write their own prayers, deliver their own sermons, and, most dangerous of all, claim that the Pope himself had lost favor with God. Some groups began calling for a return to purity, denouncing bishops, monks, even entire orders. They were no longer just marching, they were organizing, building networks, recruiting followers. In Strasbourg, a group of flagellants declared that no priest was needed for salvation. Only the whip, only the wound. In Basel, they stormed a cathedral, dragged the crucifix into the street, and bled before it, as if to remind Christ what it meant to suffer. In Cologne, they burned official letters from the Pope. They were becoming a movement, one without hierarchy, without scripture, without obedience. And that was heresy. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull in October of 1349, condemning the flagellant processions. He declared them misguided fanatics, claiming they had been seduced not by God, but by pride. He accused their leaders of lust for power, of manipulating the desperate, and perhaps he was not entirely wrong. Not all penitents were pure. Among them walked con men, self-appointed prophets, and violent zealots. There were reports of flagellant tribunals where supposed sinners were dragged before the group and forced to confess or bleed. Some towns saw executions carried out not by law, but by lash. The line between devotion and violence blurred, and soon people began to fear the penitents as much as they once revered them. Yet even as they were hunted, even as they were banned, the processions continued, just quieter. At night, in remote fields, in the hills and forests, some would walk alone, a single white-robed figure moving like mist between trees. Others would gather in abandoned chapels, chanting through the broken stained glass. They called themselves the Bleeding Prayers. They believed that though the world had silenced them, God still heard. And then the silence spread. By the end of 1350, the major flagellant groups had vanished. Not all at once, not in a blaze, but like a slow bleed under the skin. Quiet, colorless, final. Some were arrested, others simply disappeared. Many returned to their former lives, bearing scars no one dared to ask about. The Black Death waned. The world did not end. And with that, the world no longer needed men who bled. But their legend lingered, in dusty chronicles, in woodcuts etched by trembling hands, in the stories told by grandparents who swore they once saw men walking barefoot in the snow, singing songs with no words, leaving behind trails of blood that never quite froze. Why did they do it? Why choose pain? Perhaps, and because pain was the last language they trusted. Words had failed them. Prayers had failed them. The church had failed them. Medicine had failed them. Even hope had begun to rot. But pain was real. Undeniable, honest. It burned through doubt, cut through silence, left a mark no one could ignore. And maybe, just maybe, they believed that in their bleeding, someone, somewhere, was listening. In the final part of this story, we will follow the last flagellants into exile, into the mountains, the myths, and the places where faith and madness finally meet. We will ask whether sacrifice once begun can ever truly end. Until then, let the lashes fall. Let the red rivers run. He walks alone now. No chant, no circle of bleeding backs around him. No crowd whispering prayers behind shuttered windows. Just his feet, calloused and cracked, pressing down into the frost-bitten earth with the heaviness of one who has lost everything, but still walks. His robe is torn, the hem frayed into threads. The white has dulled to ash. He carries the whip, but his hand no longer trembles, not from pain, not anymore, but from the weight of silence. It is the winter of 1351. The worst of the plague has passed, but the world that remains is hollow. 1/3 of Europe is dead. Whole villages lie empty. Fields overgrow the homes of the forgotten. And the penitents, those who once bled in great crimson rivers across the land, have vanished like breath on cold glass. They were banned by decree, hunted by bishops, silenced by inquisitors. But more than that, they were no longer needed. When the dying stopped, so did the belief that blood could bargain with God. And yet, some still walk, alone, unseen, unheard. In a mountain village in what is now southern Austria, a monk writes by candlelight. His ink is diluted wine. The black has long run dry. His Latin is unsteady, his hands blistered. He writes of a figure who came at dusk, a man in rags, eyes sunken deep into the skull, back torn in ways the monk cannot describe. The man spoke no words. He only knelt before the chapel, removed his shirt, and began to whip himself in perfect rhythm. It lasted nearly an hour. Then he stood, stared up at the crucifix, and walked on. The monk never saw him again. But for years afterward, the children in that village would say they saw footprints in the snow that bled red, then disappeared into the forest. By the late 14th century, flagellation became a private act. No longer a procession, no longer a performance, but a secret form of penance, whispered through monastery walls, hidden in the corners of candlelit cells. In Spain, self-flagellation was woven into Holy Week rituals. In the Philippines, it would persist for centuries. In some convents, it was encouraged as a path toward humility, a way for the body to echo the suffering of Christ. But the great movement, the masses, the barefoot pilgrimages, the rivers of blood through village squares, never returned. What remained was the idea and the scar. There is something quietly terrifying about people who bleed on purpose, not out of hatred, not out of spectacle, but out of hope, because theirs was not the rage of rebellion, nor the spectacle of martyrdom. It was something colder, more internal, a belief that their suffering had value, a belief that God, in his infinite distance, might lean closer to the wound than to the word. The church tried to erase them. History pushed them to the margins. Their names were not written down. Their stories were whispered, if at all. They were too wild for scripture, too quiet for legend. But they left something behind, something more persistent than doctrine. They left behind the question, what would you do to be seen? What would you endure to feel forgiven? How much of yourself would you tear away if someone told you it could bring peace to the world? In an old painting, faded and mostly forgotten, a group of white-robed men walk across a burnt field. Their faces are indistinct, their backs are bleeding, but they are walking, still walking. The sky is bruised purple, The ground is rusted red, and in the distance, there is no destination, only the vanishing point. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. They weren't walking toward God. They weren't even walking toward forgiveness. They were walking because walking was the only thing left to do. So if tonight you find yourself staring into the dark, searching for the shape of something you've lost, or feared, or never understood, listen closely, because somewhere, beneath the hush of the wind, beneath the quiet ticking of your own breath, you may still hear them, the chant, the step, the lash, and the silence that comes after. If this story stayed with you, if the image of men who bled for the world lingers in your thoughts, you might find more here, with us. At Midnight Histories, we whisper about those the world left behind, not to glorify them, but to remember that they were once real. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more. Not all stories scream, some bleed in silence, and those are the ones we tell. Good night, traveler, sleep deeply, and may your dreams be softer than their path ever was.